Welcome to Tracks Through History, the Pichi Richi podcast. I'm your host, Adam Weiss. This podcast shares the stories behind one of Australia's most iconic heritage railways, nestled in South Australia's spectacular Flinders Ranges. From the dedicated volunteers who've preserved Pichi Richi Railway since 1973, to the remarkable history of the original old Ghan route through the Pichi Richi Pass, every episode uncovers a different chapter of South Australia's railway heritage. Join us as we explore locomotive restorations, railway workshops, historic rolling stock, and the people whose passion keeps this living museum running, sharing stories from volunteers, visitors, historians, and those who've helped shape the railway's past, present, and future. Whether you're fascinated by steam trains, drawn to history, planning a visit to the Flinders Ranges, or simply enjoy a good story, climb aboard and travel with us through steam, scenery, and South Australian stories. Today I'm talking to Jeremy Brown, one of the original members of the Pichi Richi Railway Preservation Society with over 50 years of continuous involvement in the organization. He's done just about every job on the railway over time, from track work to locomotive and carriage maintenance to event organizing. He's even served on the board, and he's still active today as a car captain and conductor on the trains. Jeremy's also the author of Along the Old Ghan Line, a comprehensive history of the narrow gauge route from Port Augusta to Alice Springs. Welcome, Jeremy.
Oh, hi, Adam. Good morning.
Now, you're a great resource for a history of the whole railway, and most people who are listening will know something about Pichi Richi, but people find podcasts anywhere these days. Can you help get everyone on the same page with what the railway and the society both are? What was its history, why did it stop, and how did it get picked up by volunteers?
So if we go right back to the 1870s, there was a lot of farming and mining in the Flinders Ranges, and there was a lot of pressure to get the produce out of the Flinders down to Port Augusta where it could go onto a ship and be exported. But having a bullock wagon or a horse and cart was extremely difficult in that country. And the South Australian government approved to build a railway up into the Flinders Ranges, and construction started in 1878. And the first part of the railway from Port Augusta, 40 kilometres to Corn, was opened in 1879. The railway then worked its way north through across the Willochra Plains to Hawker, and then up into the Flinders Ranges, then reached Maree in the 1880s, and then was pushed on to all the way to Oodnadatta in 1890. By then, people realised that the dream of inland Australia and farming country as far as you could see, in fact, wasn't all that valid, and the country was actually pretty barren and non-producing. And so the railway sat at Oodnadatta for quite a long time. And then after Federation, South Australia negotiated with the new Commonwealth government to hand the Northern Territory and the Ghan Railway over to the Commonwealth. And so the Commonwealth took over the operation of the railway in 1926, and they extended the railway to Alice Springs in 1929. So from 1929 onwards, the train that we now call the Ghan went from Port Augusta to Alice Springs. After the Second World War, the government discovered the coal fields at Lee Creek. And so when the coal traffic started from Lee Creek in the early 1950s, they were running 8 coal trains a day down the line. Now, before that, there was only like one train a week, or in fact, in the early days, there was only one train every 2 weeks to Oodnadatta. And so suddenly you had all this traffic on the line. During the Second World War, they'd gone from couple of trains a week to 50 trains a week, and everything on the railway was completely worn out, and it was obvious that it just couldn't carry this sort of coal traffic. And that's when they built the new railway west of the Flinders Ranges to Lee Creek, and then eventually to Maree. So it was a much heavier duty track. The weight of the rail was almost double. The bridges were much stronger. So one coal train on the new track replaced 8 coal trains on the old track. So you can see the advantage. And so regular traffic through the Pichi Richi Pass finished in 1957. There was the occasional movement of rolling stock for maintenance at Port Augusta, but there were no regular trains through the Pichi Richi Pass. And then in 1970, the little line to Hawker closed, and so there was no traffic at all through the Pichi Richi Pass. And word went out in 1973 that the government was going to pull up the railway. And a group of Port Augusta and Corn historians got together and said, hey, this railway is very historic. We must do something about saving it. Mainly just saves the historic stonework and the cuttings and the bridges. And this resulted in a public meeting. And in 1973, the Pichi Richi Railway Preservation Society was formed. And at that stage, the idea was to save the railway. And then somebody came up with the bright idea and said, well, if we've got a railway, maybe we should run trains. And in 1974, the society started operating trains in the pass, and we've been doing it ever since. So it's 52 years this year.
And you've been involved basically that entire time. But your connection to this particular line goes back even further than that, right? I think you actually rode this exact railway when you were a teenager.
Yeah, that's right. Back in the 60s, the Railway Historical Society started running quite a number of special trains because it was becoming obvious that steam trains were going to disappear. And in fact, a lot of the big steam engines disappeared in the early 1960s. In 1962, the Railway Historical Society ran a trip called the Pichi Richi Pathfinder, and they managed to get one of the old steam engines going. And we actually went through the Pichi Richi Pass from Corn to Port Augusta and back. And I was a schoolboy then and was able to ride on the train. And that was an incredible experience. And I remember the promotional material at the time said this will probably be your last chance to ride through the Pichi Richi Pass, because regular trains had ceased by then and the track was overgrown. And in fact, the steam engine had trouble getting up the hill because the grass had grown over the track and the wheels were slipping on the grass.
So then in the 1970s, how did you end up getting involved with making sure that those supposed last trips through the pass were definitely not the last? What led you to become a founding member of the Preservation Society?
A couple of reasons. One, since I was as young as I can remember, I've loved trains. And I've not just loved the locomotives and the carriages, but I've loved how they influence history, how they influence where we lived, what we ate, where we went on holiday, even how wars were fought. And I particularly loved the upper north of South Australia, the wheat frontier from the 1870s, the little towns like Bruce, Hammond, Mukra, Carriton, Jomberg, Eurelia. And so there was really my two great interests together, the upper north and the history and railway history. So when the Pichi Richi Society was announced, I joined straight away.
How'd you hear about it?
I was already a member of the Railway Historical Society based in Adelaide, and I think we talked about it there. And also I seem to remember there was some notices in the newspaper. And I've actually started restoring an old cottage in the Flinders Ranges already, and so I was going up to that area. In Corn in August 73, I went into one of the shops there, I think, and they were promoting membership. So I paid my $5 and joined the society.
So can you kind of paint a picture of what it was actually like back then when it was first getting started? What were you doing when the society was brand new?
Well, the very first thing was to sort of clear the track. The track was completely overgrown, and the first working bee I can remember going on was in March 1974. What we were trying to do there was fix an area where there was a water runoff and it was damaging the track. And then early in 1974, this idea of actually running trains blossomed, and there was massive enthusiasm within the society, with encouragement from the Commissioner of the Commonwealth Railways, Mr. Keith Smith. And things moved very quickly. In some ways, we were unfortunate that we were a couple of years late because in 1970, all the narrow gauge lines in the north of South Australia had closed, and a lot of beautiful carriages were burnt at Tarawi. A lot of old steam engines were cut up for scrap. We had a stroke of luck in that Western Australia had quite a lot of modern steam engines, and quite a few of them had been put aside and stored in case there was an upsurge of traffic. And we were able to buy a couple from Western Australia with the small amount of money we had at that time. And we were able to put together a little bit of a hodgepodge of old railway carriages and successfully run a first train in July 1974. The track was in very, very poor condition. In fact, the first weekend we ran trains, it actually came off the tracks. The track broke and the train was derailed. Nobody was injured, but the train couldn't go any further. So when we started operating public trains in 1974, we only went from Cairn to the summit, which is about 8 kilometres. And then gradually the volunteers worked on the track and we went a little bit further. And then in 1976, we were able to go as far as Woolshed Flat, which is halfway through the pass. And we carried on like that for quite a long time. And then in the 1990s, there was some funding available and there was the opportunity to extend the track through to Stirling North. And then finally, we were able to get the funding to actually lay a new line from Stirling North into Port Augusta, so that we actually completed the original Pichi Richi Pass Railway from Port Augusta through to Cairn. And in Port Augusta, the original railway station was still there, and we were able to relay track into the old station. And the Mayor of Port Augusta, Joy Belush, was very supportive. We laid the track alongside the new standard gauge line into Port Augusta, and that's where we now operate. So we now regularly run a half-day train from Cairn to Woolshed Flat halfway through the pass, and we run a full-day trip from Port Augusta to Cairn and return.
And can you talk about the importance and significance of the Pichi Richi Pass itself?
Well, the Pichi Richi Pass, and people say it's an odd name. What is it? It's a derivative of an Aboriginal word which relates to a small bush which is found in the Pichi Richi Pass. The sort of English conversion of that word was Pichi Richi, so that's where the name comes from. It was a recognised bullock wagon route in the 1860s. In fact, little settlements grew up. There were 2 little settlements in the pass. One was called Saltire. The other was actually called Pichi Richi. Both of those had a pub, and in fact, Pichi Richi actually had a school. There were quite a few people there. And because in the 1860s, there was something like 5,000 people living in the Flinders Ranges. A lot of people thought it was really going to develop into a massive farming and mining area. And so there was actually a lot of traffic through the pass, mainly bullock wagons or horse and carts. And a bullock wagon took 3 days to get through the pass. So they needed 2 overnight stops, and that would be Pichi Richi and Saltire. So, of course, there was a pub and a brewery, and later people settled there, and there was a school and a few houses. Once the railway was built, 3 days became 3 hours, and those towns disappeared. You can still see today a few stone ruins of the pub at Saltire and Pichi Richi and a few of the other buildings.
I know that the current historic railway is really a living museum. Are there particular locomotives or carriages whose stories stand out for you?
Look, I think in 1962, nobody thought that there would ever be a heritage train operating through the Pichi Richi Pass. And in 1970, there was a trip called Farewell Pichi Richi. Everybody at that time assumed that it was the end, there would be no more. And the little engine that pulled us through the Pichi Richi Pass was given to what was then the Mile End Museum and is now at the National Railway Museum in Port Adelaide. And one other of that type of engine survived. It was used as a stationary boiler at Port Augusta until the 70s. and then it was put in a park in Port Augusta until we were able to negotiate to acquire it in 1990, and that engine has since been restored, and that hauls the Afghan Express most days. So that engine probably went to Alice Springs at least a couple of hundred times during its life, and now it treads the same rail. So yeah, very, very special that little NM25, the original Ghan engine, still operates. And almost every carriage has its own story, but there are a couple of real specials. We run it occasionally for a enthusiast group, a little train we call the Commissioner's Train. The railway commissioner was really the ultimate boss of the railways. He obviously reported to the minister of the state government. And every year he would normally travel around the whole of the rail system, inspecting everything. Everybody would frantically paint and pull weeds and clean up and iron their uniforms, and the commissioner would travel around in his train. And his train normally had 3 or 4 carriages. He had his own personal carriage, which was named Flinders, and that had observation end and a little private bedroom and bathroom for the commissioner. Then we had a carriage that had half a kitchen and half a dining room. And then we had another carriage for the senior officials, the chief civil engineer, the traffic manager, the superintendent. They would all travel with the commissioner to answer his questions and point things out. And we managed to get all those carriages, and we do run it, as I say, as a charter. But this year, in fact, we're running it as a public train, and we'll go through to the a lovely facility at Ticklebelly Hill near Woolshed Flat. People will have tea there. And if that's successful, we'll probably make that a regular feature. And that'll be pulled by the little YX engine. The other carriage that's very significant is a carriage we call the MacArthur car. So in 1942, General MacArthur, head of the US Army, escaped from the Philippines with his wife and son. Traveling by motor torpedo boat and aircraft, they eventually reached Alice Springs. And MacArthur's wife at that time had just said she didn't want to fly anymore. And so they put together a little special train for General MacArthur to travel down the line. The regular train had already left. And the carriage they travelled in was NIA 36. And MacArthur travelled down to Terrarie, where he changed gauge and went by train to Adelaide and then Melbourne. When he got to Terrarie, he got out on the platform. There were media had come up from Adelaide, and that's where he made his famous call. I came out of Bataan and I shall return. And you can usually get $10 from any American by saying, where did MacArthur say that? Well, of course, they'd no idea where Terrarie was. But there is a plaque on the station today, on the abandoned station, saying that that's where it happened. So, yes, the MacArthur car is special. We also have the Commissioner's carriage from the Commonwealth Railways, which was a combined sleeping, meeting and observation carriage that went on the back of the Commonwealth Railway Commissioner's train. But as I say, each little carriage has its own story.
As a founding member who's still involved, what are some of your favorite memories of you being involved in the Pichi Richi Railway for over half a century?
Yeah, look, I've always really enjoyed travelling on trains. My love of Pichi Richi extended all the way up the old Ghan line. And so I travelled on the old Ghan 3 times, and I travelled on a freight train up the line. And in the 1970s, when the new railway was being built, we looked at doing something special to commemorate the old Ghan. And we tried to look at running a special train, but that proved to be impractical. So we ran what we called the Han Ghan, and a group of us got together and we went from Maree to Alice Springs, 875 kilometres on a handcart. Took us 8 days and 38 dozen beer, but we made it to Alice Springs. That really motivated me to sit down and record more of the history of the railway, because I had a pretty unique set of photographs of really the whole railway line to Alice Springs. And so, in the 70s and again in the 90s and again in 2019. I drove up the old railway and recorded what was there and what had been there and put that together in a little guide that I wrote a few years ago called Along the Old Ghan Line. And that's been written for four-wheel drivers and rail fans on the whole line, and detailed record of every bridge, every station, what was there, why it was there, and what you can still see and how you find it. So I think probably the Ghan, and we trained in the Pichi Richi Pass, and in fact after the trip we donated the hand trolley to the society, and we still have it there. And to celebrate 30 years since the Ghan, we actually pumped it through the Pichi Richi Pass. So yeah, that's a very special memory.
So to finish up, looking back to the Jeremy of 1973, or maybe even the teenage Jeremy who rode this line for the first time in the 60s, how does it feel to have been so involved in rescuing and reinvigorating the railway that's still running today?
Look, I certainly don't think I was in my 20s when it all started. Obviously, I'm now in my 70s. We very much hoped that we were preserving something for the future. And I think the aim of the society has always been to preserve the railway for the future, not just for our own amusement, our own entertainment, but so that people in 100 years' time can ride on a train and see what it was like. And understand how railways played such a part in opening up Australia. Until the 1960s, almost everybody and everything went by train. All the parcels went by train. The milk was picked up by train. If you lived in Port Pirie and bought a new fridge, it probably came from Adelaide on the freight train. Almost everybody went to the country on trains. If you were going to Melbourne, you would almost always go on the overland overnight train to Melbourne right up until the 1970s, 1980s. So yes, our aim was to preserve it. And I think right from the beginning, the planning was done on the basis that, hey, this is for the long term. We're not just here for our own lifetime, we're here for the next generation as well. And at Pichi Richi now, we've got people whose grandchildren are coming along. I took a photo of one group on the steam engine a few years ago, and there was John, Glenn and Jared, 3 generations working on the engine. And we're finding now that we're starting to get quite a lot of interest from the younger generation in carrying on the work. So yes, I wasn't thinking at what I was going to be doing in my 70s when I started, but I certainly hoped that I would be involved for my whole lifetime.
We certainly have some inspiring stories and memories there. I'm sure you have so much more to say, but that's all we have time for today. So Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing all of this with me today.
You're welcome.
And thank you to everyone listening. If you enjoyed this episode, it really helps us if you share it with a friend, whether you know a railway enthusiast, a history lover, or just someone who appreciates a good story. You can find out more about Pichi Richi Railway, plan your visit, and explore volunteering opportunities at pichirichirailway.org.au. We'd also love to hear from you. Come and join the conversation on Facebook or Instagram and share your memories and photos with our community. Until next time, I'm Adam Weiss. Thanks for traveling with us through steam, scenery, and South Australian stories.